You recording?
I am recording, yeah.
How exciting. Right, hello everybody, welcome to the third episode of The Right Dishonourable. Today our first topic is going to be the crisis in Syria. Late last August, on the 29th of August, the British Parliament put a motion to our MPs about whether or not we would intervene in a military way with the things that are happening in Syria, with the rebels and the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime against his own people. Now, that didn't pass. We said no, well, our MPs said no to intervention in the Syrian crisis in a military way. And it seems like there has been a knock-on effect to the world's policeman, the USA, in that Obama has now kind of stepped back a little bit and had to put his vote, has had to include his Congress in the decision-making process as to whether the United States are going to be intervening or not, and it doesn't look good.
You mean it doesn't look good in the sense they will intervene, or...?
In the sense, that's a good point. It doesn't look good in the sense that for Obama, in that he doesn't seem to have the support necessary in order to intervene.
There seems to be a sense that Obama sort of doesn't want to intervene in a way.
You're kidding, right?
Really?
When his Secretary of State is using emotive language and talking about the dead bodies of children, and is literally on the TV and the news media every single night making the case, I can't believe that his ulterior motive is actually to not intervene with Syria.
Well, I suppose
his motive must be to intervene.
What I mean is that there doesn't seem to be a desire for really decisive action. It seems that he wants to... What do you see as decisive action? Well, as I understand it, in America there's two options for an administration that wants to declare war. The president can declare war all on his own if it's an emergency, which...
Does that just mean that Obama goes in on his own? Just with like a little sword and a helmet?
Sadly not.
Shame.
The other method, which is the one that he's using right now, and is the method that was used during the Iraq War in 2003, is to consult Congress and get their approval, and that's the method that's used when it's not an emergency.
Do you think that we're going to end up missing out on... Well, missing out is probably the wrong word, but do you think that we're going to miss an opportunity if both the UK and the US end up deciding that military action isn't what they want to do? Do you think that there's a space for other countries like those in the Arab League who have said that they would support these kinds of interventions, and countries like France as well? Do you think that they have enough capacity to be able to make a difference in Syria? Is this just the UK and the US's egos being super inflated?
I don't know. I think the trouble is that every time... Well, these days, every time a UK or US politician says it might be a good idea if we thought about doing something in a country like this...
Iraq comes up.
Well, yeah, people immediately think, oh, this is just, post-colonial or post-imperialism, and it is just a case of ego and we're not the world's police, and all these anti-war cliches come out. But... I forgot where I was going with that point, but I don't think actually it purely is about that.
For example, Libya. Yeah. Libya is being used as kind of like the positive example of military intervention. The thing with that is that it was backed by the UN, it was backed by Russia and China. It was pan-cultural, pan-political.
Pan-cultural.
No, that's important, I think.
Yeah.
Turkey was one of the main players in it. And how often do you get a major Islamic country playing a role in these kinds of interventions in the Middle East? I think it's important for us not to be seen as post-colonial masters of these kinds of places.
But are you more worried about how we're seen, how we're perceived by other nations, or what is going on in these countries? As in, if you thought that military intervention could improve a situation in a given country, but you knew that you were going to cop some flack for it from the international community, would you still support it? Or is the...
I think that that's the reason that the UN Security Council exists. And granted, it gets a very bad rap. In the motion that was not passed in the UK Parliament, that's one of the first things that they say, that they acknowledge that the last couple of years, the Syrian crisis, the UN Security Council has failed to do anything.
Yes.
I think that this particular event, I guess you can't really call it an event, but what is happening in Syria has highlighted some of the problems that we have in the United Nations, but I do think that it should be a multinational organisation that decides on these kinds of things. And I don't think that... I think that we should, rather than just saying that Russia know nothing and that they have ulterior motives and they just want to support they want a stable area because they're relatively close to Syria, and that China never want to intervene with anyone. I think it's important to try and get those countries on board, because otherwise it's just the UK, France and America against everybody else.
So if China and Russia say we're not interested in doing anything in Syria, you think that we shouldn't do anything in Syria? Is that your point of view?
Because that's them abstaining. But if they say we don't think that we should wait for the UN inspectors to come back, which is what China is saying and what Russia is saying, and then make a decision. I think that before the motion was blocked in the UK Parliament, it felt like that we were going to go to war by the weekend.
Yeah.
And I think that it was...
Well, that's not actually what the motion said, is it?
No, it wasn't, but that was the impression that I got anyway.
The motion didn't really say anything, almost, because it was... I mean, the idea behind it, as I understand, was to create a consensus within the UK Parliament about what type of military action we would take, and obviously the fallout was that you got pretty much an even divide of people generally in favour of military action, although an unspecified military action, and then people generally opposed to unspecified military action.
It was just the whole point of it was for there to be an open door to participating in military action, and that door was closed, which was... I think that... I don't think that us being out of the picture is going to prevent other countries from doing this if the UN report comes back and it supports it military... Well, they're just going to be showing whether there were chemical weapons.
I don't think anyone really... This is I think the UN inspection thing is only there to establish whether chemical weapons were used, but there's no real disagreement about that. Yeah. No one really thinks that there were not chemical weapons used. I think because medicine...
But I think that still needs to be confirmed. Yes, it's a formality, and yes, everybody knows that it's something that's happened. I think that needs to be confirmed before we rush in and start with all guns blazing, and or not all guns blazing, but specific targets hit by military and missile strikes.
It does seem though, while some people are waiting for the paperwork to go through, there are people dying out there.
Yes, but people have been dying for the past 2 years, and I think that in order for this to be a legitimate thing that happens, there needs to be backing from the international community. And I think that if the UK and the US had gone in without international backing, I don't think they're ever going to get the full support of Russia, but I think that Russia may, if certain evidence comes to light in the UN report, I think they may step back and abstain.
I doubt that, to be honest.
I don't know. Some of the stuff that I've heard coming out of Russia is pretty... It feels like they are open to hearing what the UN has to say, at least.
I think it's kind of... I mean, I suppose it's pretty common for people not to trust Putin on anything that he says, but I don't think he really gives a shit about the UN. I think it's purely a means of him saying, well, look, we need to stop, and it's a means of him prevaricating and putting back any military action. But I think even if the report comes back, yes, chemical weapons were used, and even Even if
I
it
think it
details
opens the door to maybe a strike led by other countries, and maybe it's
Such
a
as?
chance for such as Canada or Turkey or France, who all play, or Italy, who all played very strong roles in the Libyan conflict, in the Libyan intervention. I think it doesn't.
But isn't
if
the-
there is
isn't the
intervention,
US
it
the
doesn't
ba-
need to be by the US and the UK. There are other countries that are capable of carrying this out.
My
And I think
impression was that the US are the best place to carry out these strikes, both in that they've got a substantial military, but also in that they have bases and also ships like that are around the region that are, you know, positioned in a way that would make them
in
a more
terms of
suitable
their
candidate.
bases, their allies are allowed to use their bases. I understand in particular manoeuvres,
Yes.
and so I don't know why that wouldn't be shut off if the US if the Congress decides not to pass that.
All right, so what would be the advantage of it not being the US?
I think that the advantage. I'm not sure there's necessarily an advantage, but I don't think that we lose anything by the US not being involved.
If the US decide that they're not going to intervene, I'd be very surprised if France or Canada or Italy decided that they would do it without them, to be honest with you.
Really? The US played a very minor role in Libya. They played a supporting role, and it was led by the French and the Turkish. And that's being held up as a very successful campaign.
I think Libya was a simpler situation than Syria is.
I think you're probably right.
I mean, strictly speaking, I don't think the US really have the military power to actually resolve the Syrian conflict, because I don't think anyone really has the military power to resolve that conflict.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the combined strength of the Italian and Canadian and French militaries are. I just think it will be difficult from their point of view if the US decides that they're definitely not going to do anything. I think just because of the military strength side of things.
I don't think that, because Syria's not really going to be putting up a fight. We're not going into all-out war here.
It's
It's
true,
just
yeah.
for strikes. And I don't think that we need the uber power of the USA juggernaut to necessarily carry out what is suggested as the military campaign for this. I think if they were going for an invasion, maybe then the US would be needed. I think for what is being suggested now, I don't think that they are a necessary commodity.
But wouldn't you think that, you know, the whole rhetoric about, well, this is just a slippery slope into war, I forget what the particular cliche is, but do you not think that that applies in this instance, that there might be the need for further force once you've initially, you know, done strikes, that you also need the option to actually expand it if you know, Assad doesn't stop using gas, if we are assuming that Assad is the one who used it?
I don't know. I think that it's silly to assume. I think you're right in that it's silly to assume that these initial strikes that are meant to be lower key won't result in total war.
Total war. Further war, we should say. Total war.
Further war. But then I don't know how you would end up restricting that. But I think that this initial stage of the campaign, because I think that they want to weaken Assad's forces so that the rebels can get a foothold, and they are hoping that the rebels, through funding and supported airstrikes alone, and stuff like no-fly zones, will be able to move their cause forward and hopefully result in a coup of Assad.
So wait, are we assuming that the Western powers want Assad to be removed and the rebels to win?
Of course they do. Yeah, of course
I don't know that that's certain at all. Certainly the press as a whole are not convinced of that proposition. I doubt most of the, you know, the British publics, the American public, etc., are convinced that they want the rebels to actually win. I think
recently, no. From a lot of stuff that's surfaced in like the New York Times and WashPo, amazing journalism from them on that. But like some of the videos that have surfaced of the way that the rebels are dealing with prisoners from Assad's forces, like It's two not very nice groups of people.
No.
And I think that was important to be shown to the public of like the UK and the USA.
So what do you think is the ultimate goal then, apart from for the fighting to stop?
What my personal view of what should be the
I mean your
be?
personal view then.
For there to oh Christ, I don't even know. I haven't thought about this. Obviously, the lack of use of chemical weapons. Although that we did talk earlier about the fact that there is the distinction between how you kill people. At the end of the day, you're still killing people.
Yeah.
But I think because of the laws that we have internationally, that is the first thing on the list. And then I think the installation of a legitimate government, whether that is Assad-led or not. Oh God, Jimmy, I don't know. This is why I'm not a politician.
We could probably go on quite some length to define what...
It would be cool to talk about the British vote,
right,
specifically, and the fact that it shocked quite a lot of people that it was so partisan, that it was split along party lines, apart from a few rebels in the Conservative and the Liberal Democrat camp. Liberal Democrat camp. What do you think of that? Do you think that do you think that it cheapened the anti-intervention argument?
Yes, definitely.
How?
I mean, maybe this is from the view of someone who, records political podcasts and reads a lot of political commentary, but I find I'm not convinced that Ed Miliband's stance was a entirely principled one, if you want to put it like that. I think it was...
to weaken the government.
Yeah, and I think in a way, it obviously it depends on your point of view, and I think a lot of people's view of Cameron or Miliband will probably be largely unchanged after all of this. Because I don't think the majority of people follow politics that closely. I think all they'll see is, oh, we're not going to war in Syria, and they won't worry too much about what the motion said, or who said what during the debate, or who voted which way. That probably won't interest the majority of people. But from my point of view at least, I think Ed Miliband I think it was partly an atonement for Iraq, basically. I think that was obviously in the chamber at the time, that idea. And because he's the Labour, the leader of the Labour Party...
Do you think that he encouraged his members to block it because it wasn't sufficient? It wasn't a sufficiently specific or wasn't a good enough bill? Do you think that may have had something to do with it rather than the general? Because from what it looks like it is just we're going to keep the door open for possible military intervention.
Yeah, I mean the whole...
and something as scoping and as widely encompassing as that's not a good bill. The
bill, I think we should call it a motion because I think a bill is technically something
you're
different.
right. Yeah,
but
it is.
I haven't read the amendment, but the actual motion itself could be pretty much summarised as down with this sort of thing. It doesn't really say anything. It just says we might maybe attack them at some point, and we don't approve of the use of chemical weapons. And we'll also, as you said earlier, where we will wait for what the UN chemical weapons team has to say.
Yeah.
Which isn't really saying anything, to be honest with you. But actually, I was tweeting to Mikola while I think it was just after the debate had happened, and he said that every debate on the current war is in part a debate on the previous war that has just happened. So
I think that the shadow of Iraq is very long and very cold, and I don't think that the British public, at least, are going to forget the way that we were dragged into that war under non-legitimate means, and by being lied to. I think that that's a very difficult thing for us to get over as a nation.
Well, the trouble is, though, that I don't think the Syria debate was entirely on its own merits. So I think that's the problem with mentioning Iraq in the same breath as Syria.
But then I think that to pretend that it's happening in a vacuum where where intervention in the Middle East isn't a recurring theme in our international policy at the moment. I think that is irresponsible, and I think that is also something that needs to be considered as well when we have these kinds of discussions about our foreign policy. I think it would be lovely if we could talk about Syria in a vacuum, and we could talk about Syria without us having intervened in the Middle East several times in the past few decades. But unfortunately, we don't live in the world where that's happened.
But I mean, when when the Mali kind of intervention was going on, it was also mentioned, the Middle Eastern thing and the Egyptian thing, and Libya as well was mentioned. And I don't think the location is I don't think it's entirely relevant. I just think it's this general notion.
I think it is. I think it's a very unstable region that doesn't like us very much, and that we've seen what bad diplomacy with those regions can do in the form of, like, it gives people a reason to join stuff like Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
And I think that we do need to be wary of the geography, even though it sounds like it would be lovely if it was if I was going to say something silly then, that if Syria was in the middle of the Atlantic, but stupid. But we have to consider the backlash that we can get from consistent intervention with countries with of this particular cultural ilk.
No, I mean that very much is an element of it. The whole, West versus Islam kind of thing, or Westerners versus Arabs, if you want to put it like that.
Yeah.
But just before we end, do you think the New Statesman's cover this week was about isolationism, about is Britain turning its back on the international community because of the whole Europe debate, the immigrant debate, and now this Syrian debate as well?
I think that it's very attractive to a lot of people on the right of the Conservative Party and people in parties like UKIP.
Yeah.
They'd quite like to just not to shut us up. They seem to think that we can close ourselves off from our closest allies, and then expand into new areas. And they don't seem to realise that, that's a completely separate immigration and European debate.
Yeah.
But I think
do you see that's the way our policy is going? Is more my question. Not.
I hope not.
But do you think we are?
I do hope. I would rather that we were a nation that didn't feel like it was our role to intervene and be the international police. I'm not particularly proud of being from a nation that sees that as part of its role. You can have a perfectly prospering economy and a happy populace. Look at places like Switzerland and the Nordic countries, who are great examples of stable democracies that function perfectly well and don't play the kind of role that we do. I would say that we necessarily miss out on stuff by stepping back every now and again.
Their stability, though, is in a way particularly during the Cold War, the stability of the nations that weren't under the Soviet regime, or the puppet regimes of the Soviet government.
Yeah.
They were in part protected by the existence of countries such as America.
Yeah.
So that part of the reason that you have these small, stable, happy democracies is that there is someone who's willing to be more belligerent about it. Do you not think?
Probably, but I don't think that we are necessarily anymore the country that is best at doing that.
We used to drink bottled gins and know how to sing, eat the trees and untouched bar. We used to dance, we'll take a chance. I lost my mind to young romance. Yeah, I don't mind, I got it back. Half the time I'm waiting for a second chance.